Ambassador, let's cut right to it because we've heard a lot about what's happening in Qatar. Tell us sort of what your organization is meant to do, and then let's get into what the actual opportunities are.
Well, our organization, the US-Qatar Business Council, has been around since 1996, and it basically promotes business and investment between the U.S. and Qatar. And as our previous speakers indicated, there are enormous investment opportunities in Qatar, but also the government of Qatar and private investors have been moving a lot of money into the U.S. as well.
Right. And tell us how that has accelerated of late, because it does feel like it's a much more diversified set of opportunities. And we'll get into some of the politics in a second. But let's talk about sort of why we're seeing maybe more of late.
Well, I think the decision by the government was made to diversify its investment portfolio before the embargo took place, because I was still in government then. And there was a move to move their investments outside of Europe into the United States just for diversification and higher returns. But what we saw was an acceleration after the embargo was imposed in June of 2017. Qatar Investment Authority decided to invest $45 billion here. About 60% of that has probably now been dispersed. More engagement on defense, more engagement in the energy sector. So obviously they realized that the main partnership, the critical partnership for Qatar from a security standpoint and an economic standpoint, was with the United States.
Right. And we heard a reiteration of that this morning. So let's dwell on that if we can for a second. Why? Why is that so important? Because, you know, I could regale the audience with your background, which is, you know, more than 4 decades as an ambassador all around the world, you know, a career of diplomatic service, not just in the region that we're talking about, but elsewhere. You understand the inner workings of diplomacy and government relations better than anyone. Help us understand why this is such a critical relationship.
Well, it's a critical relationship from a security standpoint because the U.S. has bases in the Gulf. These countries depend really on the United States to export their oil and gas resources. It's important for diversification because I think, as I mentioned, I think the Qataris, both private and the government, realized they could get higher returns in the U.S. And so it was important to develop the U.S. relationship. A part of this was the expansion now of the Al Udeid Air Base,
right,
which the government of Qatar had already spent $8 billion on and is now embarking on a $3 billion expansion.
And so when you think about your experience, you know, across the region, and we won't get too far away from Qatar right now, but, you know, help us put it in a little bit of context, because you're U.S. ambassador to Egypt, you're U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, so you understand this very holistically. Help us understand how the relationship has also evolved in importance.
Well, the relationship with Qatar is certainly involved in importance because it's largely from an economic and business standpoint. And one thing that I think we'll see in the future is an even greater deepening of that relationship with the expansion of the LNG capacity.
Right.
I mean, Qatar is already the world's largest supplier of natural gas. It generates huge amounts of revenue for the government that they use in all these other activities. When they expand by 40%, the revenue will also expand, not to mention the $40 billion in direct contracts that are going to be generated by the LNG expansion. And all that money has to go somewhere.
Right.
It has to go into defense, it has to go into infrastructure, it has to go into partnerships with American firms.
Right. Well, and on that point of natural gas, I feel like for a lot of folks, and it's probably not as many people in this room, but if we were to broaden out a little bit and talk to people about Qatar, the natural gas story would be the top of mind. And then they might scratch their heads a little bit and say, well, and there's some other stuff too. That other stuff, as we've been clearly hearing already this morning, is coming up. What's the process by which that happens, and how are you and your group sort of identifying what the best areas of diversification are? And let's talk about some of those.
Well, maybe we could first take the oil and gas.
Yeah, let's do it.
Which is sort of the centerpiece of the activity. And again, the huge investment, a lot of American firms are deeply engaged in that and bidding on the next process. But if you go to Qatar Petroleum's website, you'll see 100 investment opportunities that are very well laid out and staffed that American firms can engage in. Some are for big firms, some are for medium and small and medium-sized firms, but they've obviously made an effort to develop the supply chain, and they're putting a great emphasis on local procurement, on local content, and technology transfer, because they want to develop their own industries, and frankly, they want to be independent of their neighbors.
And so, bringing it very much to the moment, certainly the last couple weeks, when you see something like we saw last week in Saudi Arabia, obviously that was more on the crude oil side in terms of the disruption there. You lived and worked in Saudi Arabia back in the day, I believe. How does something like that ripple through the conversations, both industrially and politically?
Well, it ripples through because people are on nerve, but what I've seen over many years working on this part of the world is that this is nothing new. I was in Saudi Arabia during the Iran-Iraq War, one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century, that the U.S. got involved in a naval engagement, to say the least. Syria, Iraq, domestic terrorist incidents in Saudi Arabia. So the region has always been politically unsettled, but through this, Qatar has not only managed to grow and survive, but also to prosper.
Right.
And to concentrate on their what they do best, which in this case is the energy sector, but now in a project of broad diversification.
I would just like to compliment you for being such a good diplomat, because the sentence, the region has always been somewhat politically unstable, I can tell you trained to do this. That is a well-honed line.
It's always been a mess.
Yeah,
you know.
Exactly. always been a mess is what a retired diplomat says, right?
But people have always made lots of money there.
Right.
Let's be clear about that. This is about business and making money, and the political uncertainty, the terrorism, the disasters, and also, I hate to say this, but this opens opportunities. For instance, if companies want to go in for the reconstruction of Iraq or the reconstruction of Syria, hopefully at some point, there's no better place on the planet to set up than in Doha.
Right.
Because you have infrastructure, you have flights, you have communications. If you want to work in Basra and you don't want to live there, then you might wish to set up in Doha.
Right.
And they've concentrated, I'm sure some of our other speakers will talk about that, but they've concentrated on making Qatar a hub for regional expansion.
And are people listening? I mean, as you talk to folks, in Washington and beyond, you travel around the world, you go, to Doha frequently. How is that message getting through? And when you run into resistance, what is the resistance to this story?
The message has absolutely gotten through to big American businesses. I mean, take the Emir's visit here in July. There were huge contracts signed with GE, with Boeing, with Raytheon. In other words, for big businesses, absolutely. And of course for the financial companies, because many of them have relations with the Qatar Investment Authority. Qatar Petroleum is investing with Exxon and now with Chevron Phillips Chemical in Texas. So yes, they understand. Where we found some resistance, admittedly, is in small and medium-sized businesses, because they look on the region as very risky, but we try and persuade them that Qatar is not nearly as risky as some other places. And if you get in the market now, the potential for high returns as all this revenue flows in, it's pretty remarkable.
And so what about political risk? Especially because for a larger company, as you sort of alluded to, especially for a big petrochemical company, as you said, they've been doing this for a long time. They have systems in place. They understand this. They have, consultants and folks like you that they can turn to and say, help us, navigate through this. For a smaller or middle-sized company, political risk could mean a lot more, and could be, for lack of a better term, riskier. How do you allay those fears?
Well, we allay them mostly by saying what Qatar's done to open up the market. And of course, there's always political risk. I mean, if you were in Venezuela 20 years ago, you wouldn't have foreseen this risk either. But with the reforms on 100% ownership, on no visas, on the labor reforms, a lot of the sort of domestic risk have been very much alleviated. But yes, there's always going to be political risk.
Right.
But we try and persuade them, I think, with some success, that of all places in the Middle East, Qatar is a great place to do business.
And when you talk to people about the embargo, and you and I talked about this a little bit before we came on stage, walk us through, from your perspective, especially as someone who's talking to businesses all the time, what did that look like from dare I say, sort of inside outsider's perspective?
Well, let me say that Qatar took the high road in this embargo. It came in June 2017. They took the high road because the first thing they did was get the message out to all businesses that we don't care where else you do business, you're always welcome here. They kept supplying gas to the UAE. They've always supplied a third of natural gas to the UAE. And the high road wasn't just limited to economics. They let the 350,000 Egyptian guest workers stay, even though Qataris were kicked out of other countries. But mostly they were able to mobilize their enormous financial resources. Right. And when $40 billion flowed out of Qatari banks, they sold assets quickly to backfill that. And here's something that Yusuf Al-Jada of QFC talks about. When one of the blockading countries tried to manipulate the currency, they were capable of buying up all the Qatari currency on the international market. So there were they could take a lot of steps. What impressed me about their response to the embargo, it's easy to make good decisions when you have lots of time and you're not under pressure, but these decisions were made quickly and under an enormous amount of strategic pressure and uncertainty. And then it was followed by the reforms, the labor reforms, and the other steps that our other speakers have talked about.
Help us understand sort of culturally where sort of Qatar is fitting in from a business perspective, and I'm going to go the relatively easy route, maybe less so for Americans, talk a little bit about soccer, because that obviously is going to be a huge moment coming up. That feels like, and you and I also were talking about this backstage, sort of a signal moment in some ways in terms of literally and figuratively kind of putting Qatar on the map. How does that play in as you're having discussions, especially I would imagine with multinationals, maybe less so for a company in Texas, I dare say, having come from Texas.
No, but first of all, it generates business opportunities, to state the obvious, and then, but I think some of their neighbors were a little envious of Qatar gaining the World Cup, and I think for Americans it's hard to understand what an important issue, but if you've ever lived in Latin America or Africa, you realize it's a huge international deal. So it truly puts Qatar on the map, and they've invested a huge amount in the stadiums and infrastructure. And a point I make sometimes to businesses is that people complain, well, there's going to be a slowdown of infrastructure. Well, not really. By any normal standard, they're still going to grow about 9% a year on infrastructure spending, and they've allocated about $15 billion this year for infrastructure spending.
So I joked at the beginning when I came out that this is quite a week in New York City, and everybody gets bravery points for just getting out on the street and trying to hail a cab. As a diplomat, you spent a lot of time in New York during this week over the course of your career. How does it, just take us inside how it sort of works, and especially the lens with which we're viewing today a country like Qatar, a region like the Gulf. How does that play into a conversation generally during UN week, but especially this year?
Well, the week, I was the deputy up here and then was up here many weeks, Jason, and it's a mess. It's a mess for American diplomats because the secretary, for instance, when I worked for John, it was grossly overscheduled and everybody is late and you hardly know who you're speaking to after the 10th meeting of the day. But for smaller countries, it's really, really important.
Yeah.
Because if you're Qatar or El Salvador, you get a lot more visibility and your diplomats get to meet people that they wouldn't ordinarily meet, and then you get to have events like this.
Right.
So there are events like this going on in other places around town that will highlight smaller countries, so it's important.
Right. And so for Qatar specifically, what is the message that is important to get out to not just the United States? Obviously that is your day-to-day and will clearly be front of mind this week, but with other sort of global powers, other global players, what's the playbook, I guess?
The playbook is, I think, one, in events like this, that Qatar is a great place to do business. The financials are terrific, and secondly, that Qatar wants to be an important and positive player on the world scene, because it's hard to imagine a country that's more dependent on international stability and international trade than Qatar is. So Qatar wants to see an end to this embargo. They want stability. They want to be able to import their products and export their natural gas in a peaceful environment. So that's the message. I don't speak for the government, but that's certainly the message they're trying to get across, that we see in the business community, that come invest. It's a great market. You'll make money. You make lots of money. And we'll be as positive toward business as we possibly can.
And so in this world, in 2019, we sort of come into this UN week with, I think collectively, a lot on our plate, everybody's plate. Geopolitically, especially, we're living in a world largely driven by the United States. I don't think this is editorializing too much. That is more bilateral than multilateral in a lot of ways. I think you would agree with that, given your experience. Does that make it trickier, candidly, for a country like Qatar to navigate the geopolitical scene, because we're in a world that's demanding sort of much more bilat than multilat?
I think it does, and I think that's why the government and certainly the business community has reached out. You see that Qatar's diversified. Most of their defense equipment, of course, is bought in the U.S., but not all of it. They've diversified their purchases. They've invited in European companies to participate in this LNG expansion. But sure, it makes it more difficult. And Qatar was a founding member of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Because of its small size, it benefited a lot until the embargo from the economic integration. They saw that as in its interest. So smaller countries do better with the strong multilateral system almost invariably.
Well, and let's, as we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about the GCC, because as with a lot of folks, it's a complicated world, and certainly getting more so. Putting on your, longtime diplomacy hat, what are the next key things that we need to see happen in that part of the world to get us a little closer to stability?
Well, I think certainly the U.S. government and Qatar's been very supportive of this, have worked to heal this embargo, this rift. That actually should be low-hanging fruit. And then, of course, the major issues with Iran and Saudi Arabia, but to heal this rift, to have some kind of settlement in Syria, which is very difficult. So there's certainly things you could do in the region. Qatar's actually done just fine under the embargo. Certainly from a trade standpoint, they've managed to get better products at lower prices than they were getting across the border, but still from a strategic standpoint of regional stability, it's important to solve this, I think. And it's important for the United States to have the GCC, a unified GCC from a security standpoint.
Right.
Very important.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because clearly security has got to be top of mind, and we are not in a world where you sort of extricate, political and economic security and just like straight up security away from each other. How optimistic are you that sense of security is going to strengthen?
Well, I guess I'm not very optimistic in the short run that the embargo will be solved, but the Gulf Cooperation Council has always been sort of the backbone of American policy in the Gulf, and it had its sort of strategic military role was sort of up and down, but the GCC achieved really more on an economic standpoint than most people give it credit for. So it's very unfortunate that this has come apart, because it makes it much more difficult to have a unified position against Iran or in any other sort of these multilateral issues that is taking place this week.
Right. Ambassador Patterson, you were very nice to spend some time with us to brave the Acela corridor up from Washington here to New York City this week. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
I really
Jason.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.